Well, the virus has now killed more than 100 people in China, and new cases have been confirmed around the world.
So you don't want to frighten the American public.
France and South Korea have also got evacuation plans.
But you need to prepare for and assume
strongly warning Americans to avoid all non-essential travel to China.
That this is going to be a real serious problem.
France, Australia, Canada, the US, Singapore, Cambodia, Vietnam, the list goes on.
Health officials are investigating more than 100 possible cases in the US.
Germany, a man has contracted the virus.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
Japan, where a bus driver contracted the virus.
Coronavirus has killed more than 100 people there and infected more than 4,500.
We have to prepare for the worst, always, because if you don't and the worst happens.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome to War and Pandemic, our special reports. This is the Committee on the Present Danger, China, and we're doing this week everything about the Chinese Communist Party's war against America. Today we're doing unrestricted warfare, the CCP's challenge to the United States based upon their book written in the mid-'90s or put together in the mid-'90s, published in 1999, that talks about the information war, the cyber war, the economic war that they're going to hit the United States with, and all, quite frankly, the industrial West. We've got a great guest on this special. Special has been a big hit for us as we do these special 1 hours every day. It goes up at 5 o'clock. This is episode 152. We're distributed everywhere, particularly on AmericasVoice.news and the John Frederick Radio Network and Newsmax TV. America's Voice is Dish Channel 219. And, of course, on podcast platforms everywhere. This is episode 152, and we're over 7 million downloads. So I want to thank all the participation. Later in the day, this will be subtitled in Mandarin and blown through the firewall with our partners over at G News and GTV. We're going to have Rosemary Gibson today, her amazing book and her knowledge about everything with pharmaceuticals, China RX. She's the co-author of this book, Exposing the Risk of America's Dependence on China for Medicine. We've had her on from the very beginning on the War Room Pandemic, Jack, and it's been, I would say, an audience favorite. Every time we have her on, people want to have more of it. Remember, hashtag War and Pandemic. Let us know what you're doing. From the American Jobs Alliance about the China boycott, the boycott China products. Curtis Ellis will be on later in the show. And, of course, the one and only the great Gordon Chang, who's been at the tip of the spear of fighting the Chinese Communist Party for many, many decades. Jack, Rosemary's really, I think, got the entire country thinking differently about medicine and other things as a national security issue, just not a health issue.
Well, I think one of the wonderful things about her is that she called this long before any of us were paying attention. So, Rosemary Gibson, you are one of my American heroes for sure, and you're a big hero amongst our guests because you've inspired a lot of people to look at the world differently and look at our role in it differently, and can't thank you enough. We're going to have this connection here with her in a second.
What is it that she actually exposed that was so shocking? Remember, this book, when it came out, did not get a broad readership, and one of the reasons is nobody wanted to do a review of the book. None of the cable TV guys wanted to have her on, and one of the reasons is the power of the drug and pharmaceutical industry.
Absolutely. I mean, what Rosemary showed to the rest of the world through the pharmaceutical industry is really what's happened in industry in general in America, right? We have offshored the production of whatever. But in the case of medicine, this is a vital, strategic national interest that we be able to have supplies of medicine adequate to keep the American people safe. And as Rosemary's pointed out many times, it's not just the things that you would think you'd need in a specialized situation. These are basic kind of antibiotics you need for your kid to have an earache or a urinary tract infection. So Rosemary has been on top of this, and I recommend every one of our people read China RX. It will open your eyes up, and it will do it in a sober way. I mean, we're hair on fire guys, but Rosemary is a dedicated scholar and just gives you the facts.
How did this happen in broad daylight?
It happened in broad daylight because the American people were asleep, and it's been going on since the late 90s, ever since we allowed China to get into the World Trade Organization. And it's one of these tragedies, I think, in the second half of the 20th century we've talked about many times, where in the pursuit of profits, we turn a blind eye to some other evils. And certainly the Communist Party of China is one of those evils that we have turned a blind eye to in pursuit of profit. And now we are finding out that in a dangerous situation, that supply chain can be used as a weapon against us. And I believe Rosemary is going to talk about that. And I'm really interested to hear what she says, because they can, by just limiting us, our ability to get these medicines, kill countless people without firing a shot. And we're watching it right now. Hopefully she's going to talk about, she sent it to me last night, in Taiwan. The Danes opened up a mission, and they renamed it the Mission to Taiwan, and the Chinese freaked out, and now they are threatening to not send drugs to them. I mean, we're watching in real time what the behind-the-scenes motivations of the Chinese are. Read the book. It's happening right now.
Okay, we're now honored to have the author of China RX, Rosemary Gibson, on to join us on the Unrestricted Warfare Special. Rosemary, the question we have for you, has the Chinese Communist Party now taken something as basic as active pharmaceutical ingredients and basic chemicals for medicine and generic drugs? Have they weaponized these now into an instrument of war?
Steve, great to be with you. Yes, it just came off the press right now that NBC News is reporting that British doctors are saying that ventilators sold to them from China are actually killing people. So yes, basic things like medical supplies and certainly drugs, we know that from the rocket fuel compounds and medicines given to the military, that yes, China is using everything as a weapon. This is unrestricted warfare. Anything goes.
Is this because they're so incompetent about how they manage things, and do you think this is an act of commission, that they don't mind sending bad ventilators, medicines that are inaccurately labeled, poorly mixed? Is this something they're doing consciously as a weapon, or is it simply the fact at the Chinese Communist Party these companies are so maniacally focused on making as much money as possible they just don't care?
At a minimum, Steve, it's clear that China doesn't care what they send. They don't care that if what they send kills people, and fools on us for keep buying it. This is why we have to have self-sufficiency for critical things here in the United States. And as a trustworthy country, we can send product around the country and rebuild our economic base. But from what we're hearing now, this is unrestricted warfare. No apology, no nothing. We're sorry. We'll give you your money back. No. And we have to learn. If we keep buying this stuff, then that's on us. And you saw the report from Taiwan that the Netherlands just changed the name of its unofficial embassy in Taiwan from the Trade and Investment Office to Netherlands office in Taipei. And just that triggered China to go ballistic and say, well, we're going to cut off your medical supplies, which, by the way, they already sent like 600 masks that didn't work. So we're endangering people who are sick, and China's endangering people who are taking care of the sick. It's really outrageous.
When you say cut off the medical supplies, you're saying using that as the type of leverage you would use almost for blackmail.
That's exactly right. And if you look throughout history, you're a student of history, Steve, food has been used as a weapon of war for centuries. World War I, the British blockaded Germany and starved hundreds of thousands of Germans, and Germany didn't forget that in World War II, and blockaded England, which was import dependent. And so supply chains are in the game for any kind of unrestricted warfare. And in an age of biowarfare, medicines and medical supplies can be used as well as leverage, and they can be used as a weapon of war.
people. So I want to get to. Do you think, by the way, this air bridge and that we're getting masks and we don't want to upset the Chinese by talking about their responsibility for this because we need their supplies. Do you think that's the right way to go? Are we kowtowing to the Chinese Communist Party? Can they smell our weakness?
Of course they can. Why do we keep buying stuff that's defective? And why are we holding up, contracts in this country for companies here that want to make products, want to make medicines, want to make supplies here? This is the perfect time for an economic stimulus to build our economic recovery, to help those communities that have been ravaged by the illegal fentanyl that China has sent over. Let's turn those communities around, making legal drugs that we need to save people's lives. We talked about this in China RX. There's a quote from China's military strategy about how you conserve your energy while having your enemy become confused and spend all their time scrambling and doing things that are of not use, and they become weary, and that's when you go in for the attack.
Rosemary, this is Jack. Well, they're using medicine and the supply chains as a weapon against us. At what point do we put food production, which they need more than we need their medicine, on the table with the rest of our weapons?
Well, I think we should. I've said in China RX and in my testimony on Capitol Hill that we need to take a serious look at the purchase of Smithfield by a Chinese company with, basically the Chinese government. They got a $4 billion overnight loan from the Bank of China to buy Smithfield. That's a threat to our food security, and that's a threat then to our national security. If we got back the Port of Los Angeles, the president made that decision, then this is the kind of thinking that we need. And there are reports that Smithfield was already retooling its operations to send carcasses over to China. And meanwhile, this is before recent events, ham and bacon, they're just not producing that. That's what Americans want, but that's not what the Chinese want. And these are coming from the farms in the heartland of the United States. We need to really take another look at that sale of Smithfield.
We've got about 2 minutes, and I want to ask you, your critics or people on the other side, even conservative groups, are saying, putting out petitions, sending emails, giving interviews, saying what Rosemary Gibson is saying is going to cost you more money, and we're not prepared to do it, and the Chinese could cut us off, and so we just got to play ball with the Chinese. It's going to cost way too much money. There's no base here that we can build around. What say you, Rosemary Gibson?
We have manufacturing plants here in the United States that are ready to go, that are empty. We can use them, and we can actually make critical drugs in shortage faster, cheaper, with advanced manufacturing technology and real-time quality control. Remember, nobody's inspecting the drugs coming in from China. Nobody's checking to see if the starting materials for hydroxychloroquine. And by the way, we depend on China for the starting materials for hydroxychloroquine, whatever you think of that. And the new treatments, remdesivir, that depends on a lot of Chinese components, I am told, by a very confirmed source. So we're stuck. And is that the situation we want to be in? Is that protectionism? To me, this is about survival.
In 30 seconds, how do we get unstuck?
Invite companies here in the United States that want to produce critical drugs and supplies here in the heartland of America, and start with the Department of Defense and the VA and Strategic National Stockpile. Those are our taxpayer dollars. Let's use them to purchase product made here in the United States, bring those jobs back, and increase our health security and national security.
Rosemary Gibson's the author of China RX. Can we get, you become a real favorite of the community of #WarRoomPandemic. Can we get one more time your Twitter handle and how people get access to your website? We've got the book up here, China RX. It's a must read. Can you give us any other access to you?
Steve, yes, the Twitter handle is at Rosemary100. I welcome the dialogue with folks who are listening in to the War Room Pandemic. And also call the White House. Email the White House. Tell them that you want the Buy American executive order signed by the president. That will jumpstart manufacturing. That's an action step that if you're listening today, if you're at home, go to whitehouse.gov and say, we want that Buy American executive order signed.
Rosemary Gibson, the author of China RX, one of the great patriots and leaders of this movement to bring manufacturing of drugs back to the United States. Curtis Ellis and Gordon Chang next, after a short commercial break.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome back, episode 152. This is a special Committee on the Present Danger, China, Unrestricted Warfare of the Chinese Communist Party versus the United States, taking it off the book Unrestricted Warfare, having Rosemary Gibson, Gordon Chang, and the one and only Curtis Ellis. Curtis has been at this for many, many decades. He's been warning America. It's one of the reasons he joined the Trump campaign as one of the architects of President Trump's trade policies. Peter Navarro went in the White House. And Curtis Ellis remained on the outside and worked with the PACs and the surrogate and on TV all the time, talking about President Trump's policies. I want to go to economic, to the unrestricted warfare. One of the foundational elements of this is how they were going to use economic warfare against the West. And as we bring it up now, people are starting to become woke about this, Curtis. But for many, many years, we were totally asleep. Describe how they used economics to really attack the West.
Well, classic Chinese military strategy holds that the best general defeats the enemy before he takes the battlefield without firing a shot. You weaken the enemy. You weaken the enemy's ability to wage warfare. And they do that through economic means. That's the meaning of economic warfare. You see that they have launched an attack against our industries from their factories, from their mines, from their mills, and it's had the effect of destroying our industries as effective as if they used precision-guided munitions. The idea is, and the way they did it was by subsidizing their own industry, their state-owned enterprise, using export subsidy, subsidizing the cost of energy, of all the energy that goes into the products they export, and thereby underselling, underpricing, below the cost of production, the goods they send to America. American companies that operate on free market principles could not compete and went bankrupt. And that's how China developed a monopoly on things like Rosemary Gibson was talking about, pharmaceuticals. But we saw them overproduce steel and drive steel producers around the world into bankruptcy. That's why President Trump put a global metals tariff in place. They did it with aluminum, where you saw that finished aluminum products, such as manifold covers for motorcycles, were being sold in the United States for less than the cost of the metal that went into the product. This can only be done through subsidies and illegal practices. This is exactly what John D. Rockefeller and the other trust magnates did at the turn of the last century. They would deliberately underprice their goods to drive the competition into bankruptcy. Then when they controlled the market, they could jack up the price.
But here's what I don't understand, and here's what I think is very confusing for the audience. How did they do this? Correct me if I'm wrong. In the late 90s, there was a massive push by political elites and the political class, the financial elites, to get China inextricably linked into the world's system of commerce, trade, and finance. And they did this through the World Trade Organization. They did this through the World Bank and the IMF. And they particularly did this through giving the most favored nations as far as trade goes. So they were supposed to be, and they had all these requirements to get there. How did they have this set of rules for themselves where they could actually underwrite the state-owned industries, export overcapacity and deflation, destroy core industries all over the world, drive up unemployment, take high manufacturing jobs? How could they do that if the deal was they're going to get into a system where by definition they're going to be regulated and have to be a good corporate citizen?
No, this was a few steps towards destruction. On one hand, we had outsourced the enforcement of our trade policy and our economic policy to bureaucrats in Geneva at the World Trade Organization prior to the WTO being created, you had the GATT, General Agreement on Tariff Trades. These are basically, say it bluntly, spineless European bureaucrats. We had to save Europe twice in the last century from its own maladies, yet we're trusting them now to have a backbone, something they've never shown in the past. All the people with backbone in Europe came to America a couple centuries before that. So we had, on the one hand, enforcement by people who were genetically incapable of enforcing anything. On the other hand, we had global corporations that were happy to take these supposedly cheap goods from China so they could make more money in the United States. And then at the policy level, the policymakers basically subscribed to the utopian philosophy first enunciated by Richard Cobden in 1846, that free trade and having nations that trade with each other would never go to war with each other. Free trade would be God's diplomacy that would bring the whole world together in a great kumbaya moment of lions lying down with lambs and lambs not having to keep their eyes open when it happens. There would be universal peace, no more need for empires, armies, or nations. Compton said that. I had a dream speech, 1846. I see a time when there will be no armies, no empires. It's all because of free trade. So you had people who deliberately deluded themselves into this utopian vision. You had people profiteering off it in the global corporations and Wall Street. And you had European bureaucrats that would not enforce anything. And you had China gaining the whole system.
Let's go to tell me what the solution is today. They clearly have exposed themselves in this pandemic as only caring about themselves. They've known about, they had this outbreak, regardless of whether it comes out about the Wuhan lab, about whether they had a weapons program, whether this was a leak that came out on purpose. We certainly know now that however this thing started, that they lied about it from the very beginning, including in December. So this biological Chernobyl essentially was able to go and kind of start to, destroy the world, and particularly leave economic carnage on the world's economic system and capital markets. What is since you've been at the forefront of this and the tip of the spear, what is your specific recommendations today?
My specific recommendation is to cut off the blood supply to the tumor that is the Chinese Communist Party. We initially started down this path, we meaning the United States of America, in 2000 by admitting China into the World Trade Organization, giving them most favored nation status, on the premise that giving them money, giving them investment, giving them Western capital would make China more peaceful, make China more democratic, as well as more prosperous. It failed on 2 out of 3 counts. Giving them our money made them more militaristic, more totalitarian, not more democratic. It did make them more prosperous. That prosperity has been used against us. So what we must do now is cut off the Western capital. They live off of Western capital, foreign direct investment through government grants, as we saw, $7 million sent to the Wuhan Virology Lab. And that's just one of a host. I've got 5-page list of U.S. government grants to China, to research projects from the Department of Energy, EPA, the whole alphabet soup of federal agencies. I've been just shoveling money to China to do research. And from aisle 6 Walmart. What we're saying is boycott China by the government, by Wall Street, and by consumers. There's a link on the War Room Pandemic site to, if you want to get a bumper sticker and really spread the message. And the point to that is to spread the message to the policymakers in Washington. Put some backbone to these other 95 senators who are not standing with Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton, Marco Rubio, Jean Shaheen, and President Trump in standing up to China. We cannot be sending them money through the federal thrift savings plan retirement funds of federal workers. We cannot be letting their companies listed on American stock exchanges. We cannot be letting Chinese communist-controlled companies sell securities in the United States of America. They should be deregistered. We've got to cut off their money at every turn.
Curtis Ellis, how do people get access to your Twitter feed, to your website, and particularly to your Boycott China movement?
The Boycott China movement is at getoutofchina.us. Getoutofchina.us. You'll find my Twitter feed at America First Policies, America First POL. And there's also, you might want to follow AM Jobs Alliance, the American Jobs Alliance, another C4 organization, AM Jobs Alliance.
Curtis, thank you very much for joining us today on the War Room Pandemic Committee on the Present Danger Special. Really appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Keep up the good work.
We'll clean that up hopefully a little bit in post. Although it wasn't particularly clear, it was clear enough for his powerful message. Jack, we got about a minute. How was it, because you're a finance guy, how did America's elites sleep for 25 years and allow this to happen?
Well, I think one of the things is obviously people always have an optimistic outlook, right? They're always looking for the best case scenario. It's why people ride stocks into the dirt. It's why their financial class is going to ride their investment in Chinese Communist Party into the dirt. But at the base of it, it's greed. It's a human frailty that we seem to have in a large supply in recent decades, and it's something that we have to deal with. We have to look at it from a cultural perspective and wonder why it is that for profit, Americans were selling each other out.
We're going to be joined in a second in the next episode, in the next segment, by Gordon Chang. And Gordon is one of the most well-known of what I call the China hawks. He's been at this for many, many decades. You see him on Fox, you see him on all the major shows. He is a voice of reason. And now that we've had this pandemic that's stripped off the mask of the Chinese Communist Party for the whole world to see, one of the reasons America is woke is because of Gordon Chang. We'll return with him in a moment.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome back to our series of 1-hour specials. This is the Committee on the Present Danger, China, talking about unrestricted warfare, the Chinese Communist Party's war against the Chinese people, the United States of America, and all of humanity. I want to thank all of our co-production partners, Dish Channel 219, America's Voice, Newsmax TV, John Frederick's Radio Network, everybody to help make this ubiquitous. We'll be up in Mandarin Chinese later in the day. This show will broadcast at 5, and shortly thereafter will be in Mandarin. Now with over 100 million views and 7 million downloads on the podcast, making us the original and the largest of all the pandemic podcasts. I want to thank now Gordon Chang. When the history of this time is written, there will be a voice, and that voice will be Gordon Chang, a true patriot that has been at the forefront of trying to expose how the Chinese Communist Party really operates. And Gordon, welcome so much and taking time away. I know you're incredibly busy to come onto the show, but I was thinking about you the other day as I was going through these Pew studies, Harvard-Harris poll. I think actually the Center for Security Policy and the committee did some polling that shows that the shift in the American people's attitudes to the Chinese Communist Party has been pretty radical. I mean, now 2/3 of the country is pretty much united that they are a serious problem. 91% feel that if the Chinese Communist Party was basically the leading power in the world and not the United States, the world would be a much worse place. It's just in indice after indice. And quite frankly, this comes from the work, the laboring in the field that you and your fellow hawks have been doing. And so the question I have is, what has happened over the last couple of months that's really ripped the mask off the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, there have been a number of things. One of them, of course, is the pandemic, the deaths in America, and China's reaction to all of that. You know, I think American people are just sick and tired of elites telling them what to think about China. And this is now starting to have an effect as people are saying, look, we can see for our own eyes what China is. And therefore, this is the shift in the opinion.
Let's go back in time. I want to go back. You've been doing this, for over 3 decades now. How did how did America go to sleep and what this threat was? Go back in time when you first started, because you've been in the wilderness for many, many years, right? A couple of lone voices out there saying, hey, this is a problem, and not just a problem, this is the problem. And people were dismissed, and your rumor mongers or your fear mongers, et cetera. Go back in time when you started. What was the resistance then, and why was there a resistance to this message?
Well, the most important thing is that the United States, first of all, needed an ally during the end of the Cold War. But what happened afterwards was we felt that the world was going to move towards democracy, representative governance, free markets, and we thought that we could integrate China into the international system. But what's happened recently is that people understand that China has not become more benign. It's actually used its newfound strength to accomplish goals which are anathema to just about everybody around the world, including, of course, the Chinese people. So people have now lost patience. And when we go forward, I think that people are going to understand that we need to stand firm on our principles. We need to support representative governance, and that China is an enemy of, as you say, Steve, it's an enemy of all humanity.
Gordon, what is it like? You know, people in the United States. I gave a talk to one of these elite groups back in December, and what I gave a talk to about 150 people, and they had a dinner afterwards for about 25 or 30. This was in New York City, and what stunned me in my talk, somebody asked, I said, look, there's 1.4 billion people in China. There's only 90 million members of the Communist Party, and quite frankly, there's only a couple thousand that really matter, and it's really run by a small cadre. That's a totalitarian dictatorship. This was news to at least 1/3 of the people in the room who were part of New York elites. They go, what are you talking about? Everybody there's a communist. How have we had such a basic lack of understanding as a great power of what this enemy is and what they do to their own people?
I think part of it is because we mirror image. We think that other countries are just like us, that ruling groups in other countries just really want to become like America. So there's also a certain amount of self-deception because people are making money off of China. And so what they'll do is they'll say that China's moving in the right direction. China and the United States need to cooperate. You've heard all of these aphorisms, and clearly they're not correct. And what's happened, going back to your question about the attitudes of American people, is that the people who don't have an interest in communism are just saying, look, what's happened to us? A lot of people in New York, at the type, you spoke to, say, oh, it's great that China produces goods at a cheap cost so Americans can live better. But we're starting to see what the real cost is. 61,000 American dead at this moment, more than 1 million infected. That's the cost of cheap goods.
What walks us through that price, the China price? It comes at a high cost to the West. What is the cost it comes to? One of the things we continue to hammer on this show, and every time I give a talk, this is not about the Chinese people. They're among the most hardworking, decent folks on earth. And when you see when they have access to English common law, whether in Hong Kong or the Free Chinese Republic in Taiwan or in Singapore or in the United States or in England, they thrive and prosper and are a tremendous benefit to the community. What is life like for the Chinese people under this totalitarian dictatorship?
Yeah, the Chinese people are the most immediate victim of Chinese communism. And up until, let's say, about 3 or 4 years ago, life was getting better, better, and better for them. And so really they accepted what people call the bargain, which is essentially no political rights, but a better standard of living. And the main basis of legitimacy of the Communist Party was the continual delivery of prosperity. Since about 3 or 4 years ago, there's been stagnation. And now, of course, in the epidemic in China, they are now seeing their economy fall apart. I mean, China says that the GDP in the first quarter fell only 6.8%. Most people think that it was at least 10%, maybe even double the official figure. And, currently right now, things aren't so good. So people are starting to understand that the party is not as capable as it once said. Once this virus leaves China, once it subsides, I think that you will see the recriminations because the people in China are angry. And at the same time, they're facing an economy with uncertain prospects at best and probably a failure of the economy at worst. So this is something we haven't seen before, Steve, which is people angry and the economy failing.
You've pointed out for years and have really been the Cassandra, I think, to sit there and go, hey, you guys don't know what you're doing, but you're causing this massive problem for these people and you're causing a massive problem for the world. You've said this is a Ponzi scheme and that this is financed by the West and the technologies by the West. Walk us through the details. Well, how are we culpable, and particularly our elites, in propping this up? Only in the last couple of years has the stagnation hit, kind of when the merry-go-round just cannot continue to go around. But what has been our responsibility for allowing this dictatorship to be propped up?
Well, there are a couple things, Steve. One of them is that we certainly have enriched China with commerce, with investment. And with that, Beijing has used the proceeds of trade basically to build an army which is configured to kill Americans and to accomplish other objectives which are malign. So, in that sense, we have responsibility. We tried to integrate China into the international system. And because of that, we ignored a lot of unacceptable behavior because we felt that over the long term, Beijing would move in the right direction. So, essentially, we encouraged bad behavior because the Chinese engaged in bad behavior. We rewarded them. And, basically Beijing said, well, look, this is a good deal for us. So they continued with bad conduct. And we should have stopped this cycle a long time ago because it was evident, certainly in last decade that this was occurring. So, to me, it seems that we have enabled bad behavior in Beijing. And we can stop it because the Chinese system is unsustainable, especially under Xi Jinping, who is taking the economy back to a state-dominated model, very much something that Mao Zedong would like. He's not there all the way, of course, but state enterprises are far more important than the economy. State rules are far more critical than they have been in the past. And Beijing needs our money.
Why has Xi gone to more of the Mao model when obviously that has not worked in international free market capitalism? Why has he gone to even more of a communist mentality, state-owned industry, state capitalism mentality? What forced him to do that?
That's a great question. And I think that essentially that's what he's a true believer. I mean, he grew up in the communist system. He was a beneficiary of it. He learned Mao, especially during his teen years. People who knew him then said that he actually devoured this stuff. So I have to believe that this is a sincere belief on his part that he has to have absolute control over the Communist Party, and the Communist Party has to have absolute control over society. What Xi Jinping has done is not only taken the worst aspects of Maoism, he's taken the worst aspects of China's imperial period, where Chinese emperors believed that they were the sole legitimate rulers over Tianxia, or all under heaven. In other words, they were the world's only legitimate rulers. So you put those two things together, this Tenchan mentality plus Maoism, and you get a toxic brew, which Xi Jinping is trying to implement.
Do you think, we got about 2 minutes in this segment, do you believe that this, in his handling of the pandemic, you mentioned you think recriminations are going to come later. Do you believe that Lao Baojing, the old 100 names, the basic core of Chinese society, do you think they're going to come to the conclusion that he's lost the mandate of heaven?
They could very well feel that, especially if the economy doesn't recover as fast as he thinks. But we've got also remember, Steve, that China has been rescued many times by America. And this time we're just not going to do it under President Trump. So I think, common people in China are going to be feeling their pocketbooks. They're going to be upset at the Communist Party. They're going to chafe at more totalitarian-like controls. So this is not a good story for Xi Jinping, especially if there is intense infighting at the top of the party. And there are some indications of that.
We're going to take a short commercial break. We're honored to have on a true American patriot, Gordon Chang. Gordon Chang has been doing this for many decades. He's been there. And if the people had listened to the warnings of the Gordon Changs, and there weren't many of them, if they had listened to the warnings of Gordon Chang, we would not be in this situation today. 60,000 of our fellow countrymen dead, hundreds of thousands throughout the world. Economic carnage that will take us a decade or more to get out of. 30 million Americans a day, your fellow citizens, your brothers and sisters, unemployed, all of it. As the University of Southampton has told us, if the Chinese Communist Party had just acted as decent citizens, had acted as decent government, and allowed people to know that they had community spread and human-to-human transmission in late December of 2019, none of this would have happened. 95% of the deaths, 95% of the agony, 95% of the economic carnage would never have happened. Gordon Chang's been telling us that this reckoning it was going to happen for decades and decades and decades. Finally, the American people are woke, and they are now listening. We'll return with our special edition of the Committee on the Present Danger, China, unrestricted warfare of the Chinese Communist Party versus the Chinese people, the United States of America, and the world in a moment.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
President Xi said this virus is a demon. We cannot allow this demon to hide. President Donald J. Trump said nothing is inevitable. Human action and human agency will determine our fate in this pandemic, the pandemic that triggered an economic crisis and then a financial crisis on top of it. But it's leading to a geopolitical crisis as now America comes face to face with the greatest existential threat it's ever faced, the Chinese Communist Party. There's been a lone individual out there for 30 years telling us that this day, this reckoning was coming. And people paid attention to the Henry Kissinger of the world and not the Gordon Changs. And now we're paying the price for that. Gordon, thank you very much for coming back in this next segment. And I want to ask you about Henry Kissinger, particularly this concept he and Graham Allison have had, the Thucydides trap, that we were the declining power, they're the rising power, and just during the Peloponnesian War, that the declining power has to work out some sort of rapprochement, some sort of détente, some sort of aspect. Okay, we just momentarily lost Gordon. We're going to try to gain back. I want to go to Jack Maxey, another student of geopolitics, about the Thucydides trap and Henry Kissinger. Do you think they lulled us to sleep with this?
I think they did. I think we were coming out of Vietnam, and we thought, hey, maybe we'll create some sort of alliance here, block the Russians. I never really saw the Russians and the Chinese coming together. And I think even right now...
Why was that? People thought that... You never believed, because you're a big anti-communist, anti-Soviet guy from your youth. You never saw them as the monolith of global communism?
Well, they never really cooperated very well. Think about it. I mean, even in Vietnam, they didn't cooperate well in terms of supplying our enemies.
Because they hate the Vietnamese. I mean, the Vietnamese hate them.
Right, and I don't think culturally the Russians and the Chinese have a lot in common, to be honest with you. They have an ideological commonality with Bolshevism, Marxism, and Maoism, but I don't think that they see eye to eye, and I find it very ironic right now, for example, watching the Chinese Communist Party blame Russia for increasing infections along the border area, which seems to me a little bit backwards when they're trying to get such cooperation from the Russians. I think they run the same risk with the Russian population that they're running with the West.
The whole reason we got on top of this early was because of you. It was during War Room impeachment. And we actually took a couple of days off. We pre-recorded the Christmas Eve show. I do my annual Christmas Day, America at War on Christmas Day, Battle of Trenton and all this. And then we did, Raheem actually pre-recorded Boxing Day, the day after Christmas. When you notified me, I guess you were gotten bored, and you were on some sites. You said, hey, there's a SARS outbreak. I think there may be a SARS outbreak in mainland China.
I remember it, and I was talking to my son. We were on Christmas vacation, and of course, all I do is read. Steve and I share that problem. And so it's about 1 o'clock in the morning, and I woke the kid up. I said, hey, you're not going to believe this. I think there's a SARS outbreak. He's like, what's SARS, Dad? I said, don't worry about it. I texted you.
Well, let me ask you. That's why for people that follow China, That's a. Do we have Gordon back on yet? We're trying to get Gordon. It's technical problems many people have during this. Why you're a China hand? I mean, you follow China very closely. What was it about SARS that got your attention?
Well, SARS is like mentioning the Black Plague inside China. And it also shows you their attempt to change the narrative early on. They did not want to give it its technical name, which is novel coronavirus SARS-2, just like the first was the same SARS-1. So, and in a weird way, you and I have talked about this. If they had declared it SARS in early January in China, the Chinese citizens themselves would have behaved properly and saved the planet.
The great hero, one of the great heroes of this is Dr. Li from Wuhan. He was in a WeChat group, which is a messaging group in China. He had gone to medical school with he was an ophthalmologist. He's not a virus hunter, but he had gone to medical school with about 8 buddies. They started talking about how in hospitals in Wuhan, a SARS-like type outbreak had happened, or they were coming to the hospital, and they were giving each other pointers on how to handle it. He was immediately taken up by authorities, tortured, forced to sign a confession that said, I'm a rumor monger. You got to remember, in China, in the social credit store, there's nothing worse than being a rumor monger.
And he's actually, in a weird way, the Chinese are sort of propagandizing him a little bit, trying to reduce him. Now they're saying that there was a female doctor who was the first one to identify it, but she was responsible. She knew how to communicate this to the proper authorities. And since she was an infectious disease specialist instead of just an ophthalmologist, she had the authority to talk about this, whereas he really was trying, but he shouldn't have said anything.
Do we have Gordon back in? Gordon, we've got only about 3 minutes. Sorry for the technical problem, but just here's the question that we want to ask you. What would you advise President Trump today, what he should do in confronting the Chinese Communist Party and holding them responsible for this global pandemic?
Is what he's doing, basically investigating this whole notion of how did the virus start? Because when you start from that, we're going to see, I think, evidence that the Communist Party actually was experimenting dangerously with the coronaviruses in that lab. From that, I think that we can then start to reduce our vulnerability to China by, for instance, taking our pharmaceuticals out of the country and also taking the rest of industry as well, eventually. So for us, this is going to be reducing our vulnerability to China. The most important thing is that we have to understand that we cannot reform Chinese communism. So we've got to reduce our vulnerability to it, which means getting our industry out, making sure we don't invest in China, forcing divestment, making sure we don't license technology to the Chinese. We do all of that, and then we can sort of figure out where we are.
How big a sacrifice would that be for the American people, and how important do you think it is the American people make that sacrifice?
Well, there will, of course, be cost. We cannot have pursued 4 decades of misguided China policies and think that we're going to get out of this without any cost on us. There's going to be. But the point is the Chinese are driving this. We don't have a choice. If we want to remain free and sovereign, we are going to have to make sure that we are independent of China. And this is going to be painful, no question about it. But I think at the end, we're going to be a much stronger society. And as we've seen, we've now going to bury 61,000 people at last count, and we just cannot afford to have this continue.
Gordon Chang, you're a great patriot, and you're a great friend of the Chinese people, and you're a great ally of the people of mankind throughout the world. You've been a voice in the wilderness, and now people are understanding. They've listened to Gordon Chang. We wouldn't have 30 million unemployed, 61,000 dead, and more to come. Gordon Chang, thank you very much. We're going to get all the access to your Twitter account and to your webpage and your books and all that as we link today to the site. I want to thank you. Very honored for you to join the show. Thank you, sir.
Well, it's been an honor to talk to you, Steve. So thank you.
We'll see you tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock with War Room Pandemic.